Hey, thank you so much for tuning in to our second installment in this Christian Apologetic series. Today we're going to be talking about apologetic methods and real life scenarios. And really the purpose of today is to make apologetics as practical as possible. In fact, apologetics is a very practical discipline, and hopefully we're going to see that a little more today. But I think that a lot of people who engage in the study of apologetics learn a lot of facts, learn a lot of arguments, but don't always know how to go about applying apologetics in real life scenarios, real dialogues with real people who have real obstacles to truth. And so my hope is that at the end of this lesson, you'll at least have some practical ways to take what you learn in apologetics and use it in real life dialogue with other people. So that's the plan. That's where we're going today. I do want to just take a moment, and obviously I can't hear what you have to say, but I want to ask this question anyway for your own reflection. What do you believe the relationship is between evangelism and apologetics? I'll think about that for just a minute. I ask the question because so many people are confused over these terms and their relationship one with another. There are people I've spoken with who believe that the two things are the same. There are others that really just don't understand how they go together, and so I want to make sure that we understand this. And so first of all, let's start with this. What is evangelism? So as we're talking about the relationship between apologetics and evangelism, let's define our terms. So what is evangelism? I ask the question because I think a lot of people assume they know what evangelism is when in fact they don't. In fact, there are people who have told me that they believe that inviting somebody to church is evangelism. It's not. There's people who have articulated to me that they believe that, in a restaurant or in a store, asking somebody if they could pray with them, they believe that that's evangelism. It's not. Those are all good things. Please keep doing that if that's something you're doing. And they could certainly be part of the longer evangelistic process, but it's not evangelism if we are not articulating the gospel and giving people an opportunity to respond to the gospel. That's at the heart of evangelism. That's the purpose of evangelism. And so if we're not sharing the gospel and not giving opportunity for response, we're not evangelizing, even if we're doing other things that are good. But that begs the question, what is the gospel? And as much as I would love to say that the majority of Christians I've spoken with understand and can articulate the gospel, that really hasn't been the truth, at least in my experience in engaging with other believers. So let's make sure that you and I understand the gospel. Here's an example of articulating the gospel. We have been separated from God on account of our sin, and God, by his grace, sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross as an atoning sacrifice for our sins, and he raised him from the dead to secure our right standing before him. That's Romans 4:25, paraphrased. And all we have to do to receive that gift that he's offered us in Jesus is to surrender to the lordship of Jesus and believe the gospel, Romans 10:9. And so that, you don't have to use those exact words, but those facts have to be part of the gospel. The problem and God's solution, the fact that it's by grace, and those three essential elements that are part of the gospel. That Jesus is divine, his deity, his death, atoning death on the cross, and his resurrection from the dead. Those three elements, deity, death, and resurrection, are essential to the gospel. And so, again, as we think about evangelism, it's the process by which we are articulating the gospel to a non-believer and giving them an opportunity to respond to it. And so I would encourage you, if you don't already have it down, practice articulating the gospel so that when you have an opportunity to share it with somebody else, you're able to do so effectively. So that's evangelism. So how does apologetics fit into this? Apologetics is in support of the gospel. It's in support of evangelism. And so our goal is to share the gospel and have somebody respond positively. But as we mentioned last time, we don't talk to people who have no preconceived notions. We're talking to people who already have beliefs, who have a worldview that they're operating from. And that worldview is going to be in conflict more times than not with what we're asserting about Christian truth, about the gospel. And so we want to be able to overcome their objections, to answer their questions, to be able to remove those intellectual obstacles so that they can hear and respond to the gospel in the best case scenario. And so that's what apologetics does. And so how we engage in apologetics, or what we're talking about in apologetics, is going to largely be determined by what their particular obstacles are. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, hang with us, because hopefully it will at the end of this example that we're about to go through. We are going to talk about a method for evangelism. So before we get to methods in apologetics, let's talk about a method in evangelism, because I find that the people who are most effective in evangelism are those that go into it with a plan. Those that are not effective or not confident in evangelism are often those that don't have a plan. And it's interesting. I want to give you kind of two examples. Number one, I'm the executive director for Youth for Christ in Indian River County, and I challenged myself and my staff not that long ago with this question. How engaged are you in evangelism to your neighbors and other people in the community outside of your ministry programs? And I thought this was an important question, because these are people who are engaged regularly in evangelism through their ministry with Youth for Christ. And what it turns out is that for all of us, we are not as engaged, confident in, and successful in evangelism outside of the context of our evangelistic ministry. And this begs the question, why? Because within the context of our Youth for Christ ministry, we have a structure, a framework, a program. We have a lesson plan that incorporates the gospel. We have regular rhythms of appointments with students and other activities where we have the opportunity to articulate the gospel and gain student responses to it. We have established relationships that are already gospel-centered so that leaders and students can have conversations about the gospel in a very natural way. But outside of that, we're like anybody else, where what do you do? Where do you start? How do you move from one step to another as you're talking to somebody about the gospel? And so that's just one example that just reminded me recently of why it's important to have a plan in evangelism. I think the time in my life that this struck me the most was there was a season when I had been in vocational ministry for a while, and then I was out of vocational ministry and had to grab a secular job. And I was in sales for much of that period of time. And not to toot my own horn, but I was very successful in sales. In fact, in every context I was in, I ended up being the top earner in my sales division, whether that was retail sales, outside sales, etc. And at the same time that I was experiencing huge success in sales, I was doing awfully at evangelism. I wasn't confident, I wasn't successful, and I wasn't engaging in it as much as I ought to be, most of the time because I didn't have a plan. And I was deeply convicted by this, because here I'm highly successful in identifying somebody's need, building rapport, asking great questions, selling the benefits of a product, asking them to consider accepting the product, buying the product, and closing the deal. But meanwhile, I couldn't do any of those elements when it came to evangelism, sharing about the most important thing that they need in their lives. And this disconnect led me to really think through things. And what I ended up doing is realizing that the things that I had been trained and taught in my sales training were very applicable in sharing my faith. And so while this might not seem very spiritual, And you may have a preferred method of evangelism. I'm going to share this with you in case you have no method of evangelism. This might be a good tool to help you get started. So I've entitled this section, How My Sales Training Prepared Me to Share My Faith. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, if you've been in sales at any period of time in your life, you've probably been trained to do these very things. And so the first is engage. I remember being in retail sales and my manager said you need to greet the customer within 30 seconds of them coming in the door. Because if they're not greeted within 30 seconds, they don't feel welcomed. They're not interested in you as the salesperson. They're pretty much just going to do their loop around the store and get out. You have 30 seconds to make an impact on the customer as they walk in the store. Once you've done that, you want to inquire. You don't first talk. You first ask. You want to understand what brought them in today. What's going on with their current product? What are they looking for? What are they looking for in the product that they're looking for? You want to ask the right questions to understand who they are, what drove them here, and what's going to be the right product for them. And then once you have that information, you're going to present. You're going to match up the customer with a product that you sell that meets their needs, and you're going to present that product in a way where its benefits match the needs of the customer as they've articulated. And then at a point where you've done that successfully, and they seem to be jiving with you, you're going to give a soft close. You're going to ask a question that understands, that discerns if they're ready to buy. So for instance, if they're purchasing something in your retail store and you've presented and they seem to be tracking with you, you might ask, just out of curiosity, are you available this Thursday for delivery? Or something like that, just to gauge their interest at that point. And at that point, the customer may very well be like, yes, I'm ready to go. Yes, I'm there I'd love to have it delivered on Thursday. And then you go ahead and you write up the sale. But more often than not, after this soft close, you're going to get some objections. And the objections are going to be different depending on who's there. Well, that's a little too much money. Well, I'm just looking now. I'm not ready to make a decision until my wife is in the store with me. I was really hoping I was going to buy that product in red, and you don't have it in red. Whatever the objection is. And now a bad salesman is going to do this. Well, thank you for coming in today. Have a great day. I hope you find what you're looking for. A good salesperson is going to work to overcome the objections and get the sale back on track. And that's what we would have to do in evangelism as well, and we'll get to that. But after you've overcome the objections as a salesperson, you're going to go for the close again. But you're going to give it as a hard close. You've just presented and you've overcome their objections. Now, to all that you could see, there are no reasons why they wouldn't consider this product. And so you ask them, would you like to buy this today? Can I write up the sale for you? And they're going to say either yes or no. And then you're going to follow up. And we'll talk about that more in our context here, because this is not about sales training, but I wanted to give you an example. These are the elements that come out of sales training. I don't care who you are or what your experience is in sales. If you do these steps, you'll be successful. And so my hope is, as we apply these steps in evangelism, we will also be successful. So let's take a look at that. Same principles apply. Whether we are engaging in a one-time short conversation with somebody on a street corner, or we are having a weekly meeting, weekly lunch with a family member or friend, this first step of engage is important for us as we engage in evangelism. So I don't care how familiar you are already with the person, we want to take the time to build rapport. We want to build trust. We want to set them at ease. We want to lay a good foundation for a gospel-centered conversation. And so, yes, there's small talk. Yes, there's positive conversation. We want to have a good, positive context before we get into some deeper engagement. So engage is the first step. And then, just like in our sales approach, we are going to inquire. So, a lot of times, especially if it's somebody we're familiar with and they know we're a Christian, or we feel the urgency of sharing the gospel, we just want to jump right in and just present. But we need to take the time to inquire first. We want to understand their worldview. We want to understand their beliefs. We want to get to the heart of the matter, much of like what we talked last session when we talked about asking good questions in order to discern worldview, right? And so we do that here in Inquire. We want to ask open-ended questions, not closed-ended questions. So we don't want questions that end with a yes or a no. We want we want to ask questions that are going to get them talking. And some of the questions that I suggested last time are applicable here. What do you believe about Christianity? What do you believe about God? What do you believe about the Bible? What do you believe about the afterlife? What do you believe about morality? And so you could ask any of these types of questions here during Inquire to understand their current set of beliefs, to discern their worldview, and to know then how you're going to present the gospel at the point where you have the opportunity to do that. The big thing here is you're leading the discussion. You're learning, you're understanding them better, learning their worldview, but you're leading the discussion to where you want it to be when you're going to present. And that's our next step. Our next step is now to present. Now let me go ahead and say it. The gospel doesn't change, right? But the way in which we present the gospel certainly changes. If you look at Acts 17 at the very beginning, the way Paul approached the Jewish people in the synagogues and presented the gospel, versus at the end of Acts 17 when he's in Athens at the Areopagus and he's presenting the gospel to Greek philosophers, his way of approaching it is very different, but the gospel remains the same. And so we are going to present the one gospel, but we're going to do it in a way that's relevant. How do we know what's relevant? Well, we have just spent good time asking questions and learning their worldview, right? And so we're going to cater our approach to who we're talking to based on the data that we just received. And so at this point, we've asked questions, we've given them an opportunity to share, we've listened well, and now it's our time. We've earned the ability to now share what we believe. And so we're going to share the gospel, and we're going to share our personal engagement with the gospel. How has Jesus transformed our lives? What hope do we have? And connect your story, or at least elements of your story, to what you heard from the person. So we don't want to be disingenuous, but if there are connecting points between your story and their story, then you're going to want to share along those lines, because what they're going to see in your story is not just how God engaged you in those situations, but how God can engage with them in their situation, right? And so that's why asking good questions sets you up to present well. And remember that in the midst of this, you are clearly articulating the gospel message, and you are giving them an opportunity to respond. And technically that opportunity to respond comes here in the soft close, which is our next section. So you want to, again, this is to gauge interest. Are they ready? You've heard them, you've shared, you've tied the gospel to your story, you've demonstrated how God's worked in your life, and now you're kicking it back to them to see if they would like to avail themselves of this hope in Christ, if they want to experience the love of Christ, if they want to respond to the gospel. And so you're going to invite that response, and you're going to give them room to answer. One of the things I didn't mention earlier, but in sales, there's a common cliche or phrase, which is the first person to talk loses. So when you've given a close, right, when you asked for the sale, and they're quiet as they're thinking about it, oftentimes the salesperson is tempted to, keep talking, keep selling. We need to just be quiet, whether that's for 5 seconds or 5 minutes, and let them be the first to speak. So give them room to consider what you've just presented, and to respond. What's going to happen more often than not, just like when we were talking about sales, is that they're going to have some objections. Again, I can't say this enough. You're sharing the gospel with somebody who already has a set of beliefs that they came to the conversation with. They already have a formed worldview. The gospel is more likely than not going to be challenging their worldview. They're more likely than not going to need to wrestle with this. And so it's perfectly warranted, and we should expect that there would be objections. But again, just like the bad salesperson would be like, okay, well, thank you for hearing me out. Have a good day. The bad evangelist does that too. The good evangelist enters into that space. And this is where apologetics comes into play, right? We want to listen and understand their objections, and we want to overcome them by removing those intellectual obstacles, applying our apologetic knowledge, helping them to see past their obstacles. So stay engaged when those obstacles come, those objections. Don't get turned off. Don't get scared. You want to ask qualifying questions, perhaps, to discern the real objections, and then you're going to enter into it. And so what does that mean? Their objection might be like, hey, there's just way too much evil and pain and suffering in this world for me to believe in God. Or it might be, I don't believe God exists. Or it might be, I grew up in church and I see the way Christians really are. And, I don't want to be a part of that. Or it could be any number of things, right? I just don't have enough information. That's a big decision you've just put to me. It could be anything. But the thing is, now you're going to discern those objections and you're going to engage with them with apologetics. So, all right. So then once you've done that, and keep in mind, it might be one objection, it might be 10 objections. So settle in and be patient. But then once you've removed all of those intellectual obstacles, you've engaged on all the objections, you've answered the questions that they have, now you're going to give the hard close, right? Hey, listen, this is the truth. I mean, none of us deserve to be reconciled to God, but out of his love and mercy, this is what he did in Jesus Christ. And this gift is available to you. And I can't tell you enough how wonderful it is that God has not only changed my eternity, but he's changed my life. And I would love for you to avail yourself of this gift of salvation that he offers. Would you like to receive his grace today? And then shut up. Doesn't matter whether it takes them 10 seconds or 10 minutes to contemplate. Wait for them to respond. And then one of two things is going to happen. In our last step here, a follow-up, this is our last step. Have a plan regardless of what they say. If they say yes, praise the Lord. Your job's not done, right? You've just started. Discipleship. Get them a Bible. Show them how to read it. Teach them how to pray. Bring them to church. Get them connected to other believers who will walk alongside them in discipleship, right? You are going to walk alongside them in their new Christian journey, discipleship. But what if they say no? You're still not done. I would say, hey, listen, I appreciate you considering these things. And I know it goes against a lot of the things you currently believe. As you've seen, there's good evidence for it, and I could certainly speak volumes about how it's changed my life and how good God is. But I respect your decision. But hey, I'd love to just be able to just keep connecting with you, keep talking with you. Are you available for coffee next week? So keep the conversation going. Definitely make sure you leave yourself room to continue. So again, this is not the only method of evangelism, but it certainly is one, and one that incorporates apologetics into it. And so I encourage you, if you don't currently have a system, if you find yourself struggling in evangelism, not confident in evangelism, then I would encourage you to adopt this, at least until you find something else. But that's one. Let's take a look a little bit more specifically at apologetics now. So we're going to talk about apologetics in two different ways. One is in building a case for Christianity. So this is an opportunity where, the person's engaged with you. Maybe they're a seeker. Maybe you've let them go on for a long time about what they believe, and now you have the opportunity to take a substantial amount of time and present a case for Christianity. So that's one way. The other thing we're going to talk about in a little while is overcoming defeaters. So So you see the kind of the two sides. One's positive, one's negative. One's offense, one's defense. It's just different opportunities in different dialogues are going to afford you different opportunities to use one or the other. So again, if you have an opportunity to build a case, to present a case for Christianity, this is what we're about to talk about immediately. And then afterwards we'll talk about, well, what if you get these quick defeaters that you have to overcome, specifically dealing with an issue. We'll look at that in a little while. All right. There are way more than 2 apologetic methods, but these are 2 of my favorite. So these are the ones we're talking about today. But we're going to talk about 2 apologetic methods that you might employ if you are building a case for Christianity. And so the first one is classical apologetics. And classical apologetics is a 2-step apologetic approach. And what we'll see is evidential is a 1-step. But classical is a 2-step approach. And what I mean by that is step 1 proves God's existence, the theistic God's existence. Step 2 proves that Christianity is true. So another way to look at this is step 1 proves theism as a worldview. And step 2 proves that of the theistic religions, Christianity is the one that's true. Or again, looking at it the way I have it on the screen, step 1 is to prove that God exists, and step 2 is to prove that Christianity is true. There are a lot of examples of this. One of my favorite, and one that was instrumental in my coming to understanding of Christian apologetics, is by Norman Geisler. And this is a great book. I encourage you to get it. In fact, I believe they just released or are just releasing an updated version. But Norman Geisler and Frank Turek wrote this book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And in this book, they give 12 reasons, 12 points that prove that Christianity is true. And you might be thinking, Kevin, you just said that classical apologetics is a 2-step approach, so why are they giving 12 steps? Well, we'll take a look at that together, but in the course of those 12 steps, there are really 2 tiers, if you will. The first proves that God exists, the second proves that Christianity is true. So I'm going to give you a very quick crash course in their argument, just so you could see an example of a classical apologetic method. And so here's the example. So again, 12 points. We'll start with the first one here. Truth about reality is knowable. And Dr. Geisler was big on this because in our postmodern world, the very truth of truth is up for grabs. People don't believe in a correspondence view of truth anymore, or at least not consistently. There's people who believe that you can't know truth, or that's true for you but not for me. And so his 12-point argument starts by establishing that truth about reality is knowable, and that it's the same for everybody. So we'll, again, pick up that book. It's a great book. We don't have time to really settle into each of these arguments, but that's where he starts. He goes on and affirms the law of non-contradiction by saying that the opposite of true is false. You can't have 2 statements that are mutually exclusive be true at the same time and in the same sense. So what I mean by that is I can't be Kevin and not Kevin at the same time and in the same sense. Thinking about it in terms of engaging in other worldviews, God can't exist and not exist at the same time and in the same sense. So therefore, atheism and Christianity can't both be true. There can't be only one God and be many gods at the same time and in the same sense. So therefore, Christianity and polytheistic religions can't be true at the same time and in the same sense. It can't both be true. Again, the law of non-contradiction. In fact, Geisler quotes an Islamic philosopher, medieval philosopher, Avicenna, who said that anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until they admit that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. So, not advocating for beating and burning people, but certainly that underscores the point that the opposite of true is false. You can't have two mutually exclusive truth claims be true at the same time in the same sense. His third point is that it is true that the theistic God exists. And they argue this on three different premises. They argue it based on the fact that the universe had a beginning and therefore needed a beginner, a form of the cosmological argument. They argue it from the design of the universe, and therefore the universe had to have a designer, and they argue it through the moral argument. And so those are great arguments. Again, get the book, learn the arguments. I think that's very helpful. Once they've established the truth for God. Now, again, first of all, I told you that a classical apologetic approach has two steps, right? Proving God's existence and then proving Christianity is true. These first three of their 12 steps covers that first tier, right? So they have established God's existence after step 3. So now the rest of 4 through 12 are really going to prove that Christianity is true. So their fourth premise is, if God exists, then miracles are possible. And that's, true by definition. If God exists in the way we conceive of him, in the way that those arguments they use in step 3 prove him to be, that he's all powerful, that he's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all powerful, personal, then miracles are absolutely possible. And point 5, miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. Think about it logically. If God sent a message through a prophet, right, and confirmed it by a miracle, which by definition only God can do, then that miracle confirms that that message is in fact from God. Point 6, the New Testament is historically reliable. And they go through a whole bunch of evidence, which is really helpful for us to know. I encourage you to study these things because the New Testament, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the evidence for the historicity of the New Testament. We have early manuscripts. We have such a large amount of manuscripts that it's virtually impossible for us to mess up understanding what was originally written, because we have so many early manuscripts that we could compare them to. So if you think about those that copied manuscripts, right? If they made an error, well, you compare that 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 to the over 5,000 early manuscripts we have, and it's clearly obvious what the original intent was. So again, all those things. The New Testament is corroborated by non-Christian sources, Roman sources, Jewish sources. There's just so much evidence. So they establish that point in their larger argument. In point 7, the New Testament says Jesus claimed to be God, and they demonstrate that scripturally. 8, Jesus' claim to be God was miraculously confirmed. And so their arguments on this line are the fact that Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecy, that he lived a miraculous life, and that he lived a sinless life. And point 9, therefore Jesus is God. And we're coming to the end of their argument here. If Jesus is God, then whatever Jesus, who is God, teaches is true. Jesus taught that the Bible is the Word of God. Therefore, it is true that the Bible is the Word of God, and anything opposed to it is false. Again, why did they establish the truth, and why did they establish that the opposite of true is false? Because now the conclusion holds. Because not only have we established these truths, but anything that stands against it must be false by the law of non-contradiction. And so, again, we see that Christianity is not only just true, but anything that stands opposed to it is false. And so in 12 points, Dr. Geisler and Dr. Turek have made the case that Christianity is in fact true. So even though I really skimmed over that 12 points, you can imagine that's a pretty long argument, and you would probably need substantial amount of time to walk people through a 12-point argument. It'll certainly take you some time to read the book form of it, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So when do you use classical apologetics? I would just, for practicality, tell you when you have time and opportunity for a longer presentation. I would also say when dealing with atheists, because again, by establishing the obviously the existence of God, but even dealing with some issues like related to truth, I think that's all important. In fact, that's why I put here also when confronting postmodern objections, because again, you want to establish truth. You want to be talking on the same plane, not past each other. So you really need to agree on truth and what it means to understand something or to affirm a truth claim. So that's some of the things that I would say in regards to when to use classical apologetics. This has been, I would say that my approach to apologetics in most scenarios is about 50% classical apologetics and 50% evidential. Yes, this requires more time. It's also very helpful. It literally walks you baby step by baby step through the entire argument. And I think that that is very helpful for people to digest throughout the process. But again, making time for it is going to be critical. Let's talk about the second one, evidential apologetics. And evidential apologetics streamlines the process a little bit. Again, they're both important. They're both good ways to approach it. Your apologetic method is not going to be dictated by what you want to use. Your apologetic method is going to be dictated by what is the best approach for the person you're dialoguing with. And so at times classical might seem like the best course, at others evidential might. So Gary Habermas is an apologist who uses the evidential approach primarily, and here's what he has to say about it. Instead of having to prove God's existence before moving to specific evidences, the evidentialist treats one or more historical arguments as being able both to indicate God's existence and activity and to indicate which variety of theism is true. And so what Dr. Habermas is saying here is that instead of having to go through the whole process and establish God's existence before getting to pointing to Christianity, you could jump right into historical arguments that prove Christianity is true, and along the way, it clearly points out that God must exist as well. And so we're going to take a look a little bit at this method of apologetics. So obviously, if you're going to be an evidentialist or use evidential apologetics, you're going to want to hit on evidence for a historical fact that is substantial enough to accomplish all that you're seeking to accomplish, to prove that Christianity is true, prove that God exists. And so here's just some of the arguments that evidential apologists have used. The resurrection of Jesus. There's a reason why it's bolded and underlined. I'm going to go ahead and just let the cat out of the bag instead of burying the lead. This is the number one historical event that evidentialists demonstrate evidence for that proves the case for Christianity. This is certainly Dr. Habermas's. Dr. Habermas is the foremost expert on the resurrection of Jesus, and he's built a whole career on the resurrection. Some other ones that evidentialists would use, New Testament fulfillment of messianic prophecy. I have used this one, but mostly it is with Jewish people. They seem to be the ones that are most receptive because they already have some stock in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Even the Jewish people that are not very religious will still give some respect to their own scriptures. And so starting there and moving to the New Testament and demonstrating the fulfillment has been effective for me, at least in the past. Some evidentialists show evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. Okay, and others the rapid expansion and survival of the early church, despite the odds stacked against it. In my opinion, more often than not, there's really only one historical event that you really need to spend your time with, and is the most evidenced. So the resurrection of Jesus is not only the most critical, right? It's the heart of the gospel. Jesus died on the cross, and he rose again from the dead. If he had just died on the cross and he didn't rise from the dead, there would be no gospel, right? The resurrection of Jesus, well, he can't rise from the dead unless his death is already established. The resurrection of the dead is a clear miracle that only God could have accomplished. And it confirmed, as Geisler would have said, it confirmed claims, right? So it confirmed a message from God. So Jesus said a whole lot of things about himself and about his relationship to the Father. He predicted his resurrection, and then he accomplished his resurrection. And so if you could demonstrate the truth of the resurrection of Jesus, you have proven that God exists because a miracle that cannot be explained away has happened, and you have proven that Christianity is true. So most evidential apologists will spend most of their time and energy on the resurrection of Jesus. That's what I would do, and that's what I suggest you would do as well. Coming up in our series, we will be spending 2 sessions on the existence, the deity, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And so that'll be helpful for you in having those evidences and arguments to be able to use in this evidential approach. So when to use the evidential approach to apologetics? Well, when you need to get to the heart of the matter quickly. I don't want to keep talking about it in terms of time, but it is much more streamlined because you could jump right to one particular set of arguments, one particular event you want to substantiate, versus going through the entire process of a classical apologetic approach. I would also say when your dialogue partner's objections are historical in nature or specifically related to elements of the gospel, then jumping in here, especially with the resurrection of Jesus, is helpful. When there's some agreement on what constitutes evidence, or I would even say truth. So again, if you need to first establish truth, if you're dealing with somebody who is embedded in a postmodern worldview, then perhaps classical apologetics might be a better way to start, as Geisler's method demonstrated. But all right, well, we've mentioned postmoderns a couple times. And since we are in a day that many would consider postmodern, and you will certainly engage with people whose views on truth are postmodern, it is important for us to also at least touch base about postmodernism. So here's some tenets of postmodernism, and perhaps some of these will already be familiar to you. So postmoderns believe that no one has the privileged position, the God's eye view. Everyone's quote-unquote interpretation is as valid as the next. And so, this is the important thing. It doesn't matter what we're talking about, right? Nobody has cornered the market. Nobody has perfect understanding. They only have an interpretation that comes from their vantage point. The next point, there are no accurate meta-narratives. And what we mean by that is there are no truths that are true for all people, all places, all times. There's no truths that are just, an umbrella that everybody falls under, right? So some of the ways we have seen this in even our modern culture, right, is let's think about the issue of gender, right? We would, a modernist, not a postmodernist, a modernist would say that there are definitively 2 genders biologically, right? And they would argue for the X and Y chromosomes, and 2 X chromosomes is one gender, and X and a Y is a different gender, and here you go. This is the way this is a meta-narrative that's true for all people, all times, no matter where you are or who you are. A postmodern would say, well, no, that's your interpretation from your linguistic community, and by trying to impose that on us, you're actually doing violence to us. We interpret it differently from our vantage point. There are no overarching meta-narratives. And so they would give different criteria for determining gender. So that's perhaps a good way of kind of demonstrating the contrast between a modernist and a postmodernist way of taking a look at one particular issue that is forefront in our culture today. So again, another tenet of postmodernism, we understand by means of our interpretive community. So if you were born in a different socioeconomic class, if you were born in a different place in the world, if you were born at a different time period, if you were born under different circumstances, if you were born with a different skin color, you would interpret things very differently. And they would argue that on account of these things and others, truth is therefore relative, right? So there is no objective truth. There are no meta-narratives, right? There's no objective truth. All truth is relative. We construct it based on our understanding of the world, which might be different from somebody else's. Again, I'm not advocating for postmodernism. I'm just trying to help you understand what postmodernism would affirm. So those are some of the tenets of postmodernism. One of the things you'll find is that, the way that postmodernism deals with truth is actually self-defeating. Here's just an example, right? So this is a common statement, or at least belief, that a postmodernist would argue. There is no such thing as absolute truth. To which somebody might respond, is that an absolute truth? And actually, Geisler and Turek draw this out well in their book. They call it the Roadrunner method, because you could quickly, as you're engaging with somebody, take the statement that they just said and apply it to themselves, apply it to the principle to this very statement, and it demonstrates whether the statement is self-defeating or not. So somebody making a comment that there is no such thing as absolute truth, well, that's an absolute truth statement. So therefore, it's a contradiction. It's self-defeating. Here's another one. Truth is relative. Is that a relative truth? That's true for you, but not for me. We've all heard that one, right? Well, is that statement true for you, or is it true for everybody? There is no truth. Is that true? So these might seem silly, or it might seem like semantics, but the truth of the matter is, it demonstrates that there's a flaw in the way postmodernists think, because the very statements they're making are self-defeating. And so that's, it ends up being nonsensical. They're trying to say something, but really what they're doing is they're not saying anything at all, or not anything of value. Here's another question. We're going to kind of tackle this a different way. When we read a book, any book, what is the source of its meaning? Think about it for a second. When we read a book, any book, what is the source of its meaning? Is it the author, or is it the reader? So if you talk to a postmodernist, they would say it's the reader, because it's how they interpret it, and everybody might interpret it different. But the truth of the matter is it's the author. In the same way that if you wrote a letter to somebody, you would expect that letter would be interpreted the way you intended it to be interpreted, and not to interpret it any way you want, right? If I write a letter to my wife and she misinterprets it, I might be sleeping on the couch. I really want her to get it the way I mean it. This is a great book by Kevin Van Hooser. Is there a meaning in this text? And he is arguing for an objective meaning in Scripture. And this book was largely written in response to this book by Jacques Derrida. He is the father of deconstructionism. This is completely a postmodern work, and his book is pretty much saying that there is no truth that the author passes on. It's the reader, and we need to deconstruct that, and it's the reader that constructs an understanding or interpretation of what they're reading. But that's interesting, because he's writing a book of which he has a thesis. He's trying to make a point. He expects people to read the book and to understand it the way he is trying to convey it. And do you see the self-defeating nature? Do you see the problem here? Why write a book when your thesis is that the words of the book have no objective meaning? It's pointless. Well, that's postmodernism in a nutshell. And again, without going too far into the weeds, being able to start listening to the way people argue or statements that people make, identifying those statements that are self-defeating, and then demonstrating the fact that they are self-defeating is a really important tactic. And again, we want to approach this with respect, right? We don't want to be like, well, that's stupid. We want to show the flaw in their thinking, because then they'll realize that, wait a second, the way I'm thinking doesn't make sense. I need to figure out what does make sense. And that opens the door for you to have a conversation about truth and about the truth. All right. So that was my little rabbit trail on postmodernism. We talked earlier about building a case for Christianity. We did that both with the classical apologetic method and with the evidential apologetic method. Now I kind of just want to walk through some defeaters, because at times, especially in shorter engagements or engagements with people that you're already in relationship with, you might not sit down and have an hour-long conversation. You might have moments where you get to deal with things. Or over the course of a longer conversation, some defeaters might come up throughout the course of the conversation. We want to think through how you would answer. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of list them, and then I want to pause for a moment with each of these, and you could pause the recording, but would love for you to think through how would you answer these defeaters, and I'll give you some ideas too. Christianity is too restrictive. So if it's, why don't they believe? Well, Christianity is too restrictive. It's one that comes up a lot. Different wording perhaps, but that same sentiment. What would you say? Well, many ways you can talk about this, the fact that Christianity is too restrictive. One is that, for those that are not in a relationship with God, who don't understand or don't believe in his existence, clearly it's not important to them to fall in line with the way he says they ought to live. But for those of us who have been saved by the Lord, who understand he is a good father, we desire to please him, and what's important to him becomes important to us. And so, as we're sanctified, we don't find it as restrictive, or don't find it restricted at all. There's a youth pastor at a church I used to go to who, I think it was his first sermon, he was preaching on a Sunday morning, and he used an interesting illustration here too. He said, if I get a brand new sports car, and in the instruction manual says I have to put in premium gasoline, and instead of putting in premium gasoline, I decide I'm going to fill the gas tank with bubbles, because I would love to see bubbles come out the back of my exhaust as I'm driving my sports car down the road. What would happen if I put bubbles in the gas tank? The car's not going to run. That was a funny illustration he gave, but it serves an important point. The car was created to run optimally under certain circumstances, and even if we want to do something different, that doesn't mean that there's going to be a positive outcome, right? Things are created to be a certain way. And the same is true with our life. God gives, rules to live by, because if we abide by them, not only is it pleasing to God, but we live optimally. We have the best life possible by being obedient to these things that he has set up. I was teaching this very lesson not that long ago, and somebody made another good statement, said that, a seatbelt is restrictive, but it's there for our protection. And that's true. So when we think about why God even gives rules, again, it's not because he's a cosmic killjoy, but because he loves us. So those are some ways you can engage with that defeater. Christians are homophobic. How would you respond to that? I would suggest that this is a misrepresentation, a caricature of Christianity. Certainly there are Christians that have really given a bad reputation to Christianity, to the church, in terms of how they've engaged with the LGBTQ community. However, homosexuality is no different than any other sin. Is it sin? Yes, it's sin, absolutely. But God doesn't not love them because it's that particular sin versus other sinners who he loves. Salvation is not offered to everybody else, but not to homosexuals. And we need to clear away some of these misrepresentations by demonstrating that Jesus came and died for all. We as the church ought to love all people and demonstrate the love of Christ. We need to be willing to share the gospel and hope for restoration and reconciliation with God of all people who don't believe, including those in the LGBTQIA camp. So again, it's a misrepresentation, not true at all. And so that might be a good moment to apologize for those that have really tarnished the name of Christ in the ways in which they have come against homosexuals in particular. So Christians are a bunch of hypocrites. There's the next one. Well, this is an interesting one too. I do know a bunch of Christians who are hypocrites. But guess what? That doesn't disprove Christianity. So if I'm a hypocrite, if I'm a jerk to you, if I'm a big mean person who does wrong every day, but I say that 2 + 2 = 4, does 2 + 2 not equal 4 because I'm a hypocrite? No, of course not. Truth doesn't cease to be true because the advocate of truth is a hypocrite. So therefore, as a defeater against Christianity, this doesn't really hold water, because even if Christians don't live as they're called to live, it doesn't discredit the truth of Christianity. With that being said, there are other things that we ought to share in this moment, which is that Christians are not perfect, and Christians really ought not to claim that they're perfect. We're forgiven by grace because of what Jesus did on the cross and from his resurrection from the dead. We are being perfected, right? We are being sanctified. One day we'll be without sin, but certainly that day is not today. Christians are called to higher living. They're called to not live as hypocrites. But the reality is that we trip and fall just like everybody else. And again, it doesn't disprove Christianity. And we need to get back to that. So don't let it be a red herring that puts an obstacle in the path of the gospel. Christians believe in fairy tales. Well, if you abide with us for the next couple weeks, you'll see there's so much evidence for the truth of Christianity that we could easily dismiss this. No, we do not believe in fairy tales. We have more evidence for what we believe than any other worldview that exists. I can't believe in God because there's too much evil and suffering in the world. This is actually going to be the topic of our next installment, so I encourage you to tune in. But this is certainly one that we have to first of all pause and recognize that, yes, this could come from a place of making a volitional, intellectual argument against Christianity. But more often than not, there's experience and pain attached to it. Evil, pain, and suffering is a universal human phenomenon. We have all experienced it, and some have experienced it greatly. And so as we come across people who say, I can't believe in God because there's too much evil and suffering in the world, we have to respect the fact that they might have lived through some really bad suffering, or have somebody that they love has walked through some really bad suffering. And so I'm not saying we don't engage it apologetically, but we definitely want to also engage it pastorally. And again, for some answers on how to overcome this objection, tune in next time. I can't believe in a God of judgment and wrath. I don't know if I used this example last time or not, but I'll go ahead and say it briefly now. If we went into a courtroom where there was a murder trial happening and the family of the victim was there and the evidence was overwhelming that the defendant was guilty of murder, and he had this grin on his face the whole time. He's not regretful, remorseful at all for what he's done. And the judge turns to him and says, listen, the evidence is stacked against you. Clearly you did this, and clearly you're not remorseful, but I'm going to show mercy to you, and I'm going to let you go. Would everybody applaud because of the mercy of the judge? No. we'd walk away with a sick feeling in our stomach because of an injustice that had just taken place. Certainly the family of the victim would not be happy that the judge just let the murderer go, right? There's something in us that cries for justice. And God is perfectly just. In the same way that God is love, God is just. God is justice. And so, we say, I can't believe in a God of judgment and wrath, but I think that's a caricature of God. He's not walking around looking to condemn people. In fact, we could demonstrate from 100 places in the Bible the love that God has, and his desire to redeem people, to forgive people, and to give them hope in a future. So clearly we want to be able to have those scriptures at the ready to be able to do that. But certainly the fact that God is just and judge does not diminish the truth of Christianity. If anything, it makes it more palatable if we're being reasonable. The Bible is unreliable and can't be taken seriously. Again, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the evidence for the reliability, the historicity of the New Testament. We do for the Old Testament too, so let me first be clear on that. Jesus, first of all, is evidence for his deity. He affirmed the Old Testament. We have archaeological evidence for the Old Testament. We have various manuscript traditions of the Old Testament. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have a lot of different things and the consistency between to demonstrate the Old Testament reliability. But when it comes to the New Testament reliability, there is just so much evidence that it's laughable to assert that it's unreliable and can't be taken seriously. And so I encourage you, because we're not going into depth in this particular topic in this series, to pick up that book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, by Geisler and Turek, because they do address this well. All right. Well, that's some of the defeaters that you might come across along the way. Hopefully that gave you some opportunity to think through some of them. But don't wait till you're in a moment where a defeater's thrown at you to start thinking of how you would overcome it. Think about some of these things so that when it comes up, you at least know where you want to start in addressing the issue. So next time, we're going to be talking about the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, and I hope you will tune in with us. Thank you so much for tuning in today. God bless you.